Hey, as I commented already, I got this new headphone, but it's having some issues. Maybe I have fixed it, so let's see. Not complaining so far. Here is the deal. I have this nice paper on principles for just food system transitions. We talk a lot about climate change impacts, but climate change impacts are not gender neutral. They are not, equal for the rich and the poor. The poor are obviously more vulnerable, and often they haven't contributed actually to the problem itself. So, envisioning a more equitable and sustainable future and an inclusive path to achieving it. Obviously, food system transitions are needed because the way things are going with climate change, we will need to consume less meat or rely on laboratory meat or find ways to produce meat without having so much environmental impact, so many environmental impacts. I've discussed the diets and environmental impacts, carbon footprints elsewhere that you can follow up. Executive summary here is that food production has grown dramatically in recent decades. Population growth, rich people consuming more, wasting more, and even poor countries are wasting a lot. So this is driven by technology, increased use of agricultural inputs, and the expansion of farmland. Yet, although on a global scale we produce enough calories for all, hunger and malnutrition remain pervasive and have worsened since the COVID-19 pandemic, which, I'm recording this in October of 2024. The pandemic ended, almost 2 years ago, but we are still having the post-pandemic impacts continue in various ways. At the same time, obesity and chronic diseases are on the rise due to unhealthy diets. From a livelihoods perspective, food value chains raise major social justice concerns. Food production employs about 27% of the global workforce, with much larger shares in the global south. Country like India, 60% of the employment often comes from the agricultural food sector, but almost 94% of agricultural workers are employed informally, so those are not permanent jobs, and farms and food processing plants alike typically pay low wages with poor job security, no social protection, and often hazardous conditions. Many farmers live in poverty, even in the global north, and often receive prices that do not properly reflect their costs and labor or are highly volatile. A lot of migrant laborers, farm laborers in the US, for example. So there are more points like this about food systems that are devastating the natural environment. There's a lot of impacts on biodiversity loss, habitat losses, freshwater withdrawals, and degrading soils. The livestock sector, of course, has particularly large climate impacts, and climate change is, of course, an urgent issue. The food system, including production and value chains, is responsible for around 37% of the global greenhouse gas emissions, and emissions are projected to keep rising. So, food production systems and the livelihood of food producers are also highly vulnerable to climate change, particularly in the global south. So, what are the principles for just food system transitions? This is where the concept of just transition comes in. Transitions comes in. This report lays out 10 guiding principles for achieving just food system transitions and explores their implications in terms of desired outcomes, planning and decision making processes, systemic changes that may be needed, and tensions that must be managed. The purpose of these principles is to guide actors working with food systems, which include governments, businesses, and investors, as well as farmers, labor unions, international organizations, civil society organizations, and rural communities, in promoting a global food system that works better for people, nature, as well as climate, of course. They offer a framework that can help to define what kinds of change should be supported and how change processes themselves should be managed around the world. So, these are the 10 guiding principles for achieving just food system transitions. You have category 1, and then you have principle 1, principle 2, out to principle 10 here. So, category 1, movement towards a food system that is equitable and sustainable. Category 2 is just processes of change. And category 3 is using change to address systemic social and economical inequalities and vulnerabilities. And of course, they're all connected through these gears that we are looking at. Principle one then, a just transition must move deliberately towards global food system that works better for people, nature, and the climate, so toward a global food system, meeting everyone's nutrition needs, operating within planetary boundaries, which I'm not going to touch on here, but the report has a schematic, a graphic, infographic, providing good livelihoods, protecting the rights of people, protecting animal welfare, ensuring climate resilience, avoiding and reversing environmental degradation, avoiding and correcting power imbalances in food value chains and in rural areas. Principle 2, structural changes in food systems that must occur without delay, recognizing the urgency of the need for this change. And it's jumping to principle 10 here because the way I probably organized it. Yeah, so nonetheless, let's read the other principles and come back. Principle 3, planning and implementation of transitions must be socially inclusive, ensuring that there are ongoing opportunities for wide stakeholder involvement in and influence over the transition processes themselves and ongoing socio-economic development planning. So you have to synergize these things: economic development plans, food system transitions, and so on. Principle 4, food producers and their communities must be supported in bearing the costs of changing practices to align with a more ecologically sustainable food system and in managing the wider socio-economic impacts of transition. Principle 5, then, those who are unable to continue farming or working in food value chains should be supported to reskill and find new livelihood opportunities and have access to social safety nets. These kind of dropout of unskilled labor who are outdated in some ways can cause all kinds of problems, especially the choices they make during elections based on misleading information from people who are not really helping them, right? Principle 6, consumers should be able to meet their nutritional needs during the transition and not experience hunger or hardship due to increases in the cost of food. Food access, availability, and physical and economic access, and quality, of course. Principle 7, excuse me, it's very humid, so I'm getting dehydrated. Principle 7, historical environmental degradation associated with food system should be remediated with priority to reversing harm that continues to affect local people's health, livelihoods, and or ecosystems, applying the polluter pays principle. Principle 8, priority for financial and other external support should be given to those regions, industries, workers, and citizens who are most vulnerable and who face the greatest risks and challenges and have least capacity to fund transformation. Who will do it is kind of a different question, separate question, but we'll see ways forward on that. On a global scale, in the near term, the burden of shifting to more sustainable, low greenhouse gas food production and consumption should be borne mainly by those with the greatest resources and the most cumulative responsibility for environmental harm. Well, this is talking about cumulative CO2 over time, which is the rich countries, but are they going to pay for this? Well, in principle, they should. Finally, principle 10, efforts to transform global food systems should address the root causes of social and economic inequality, food insecurity, environmental injustice, public health risks, and vulnerability. Good holistic principles, but how do we make them happen? So I'm not going to read all these details, but basically the principles can be grouped into three categories, as we already saw. Principles 1 and 2 describe what a just and sustainable food system would look like and the scope and pace of changes needed to achieve it. I'm tracking time here because I have a meeting in about 15 minutes. Should be okay. So they point us in the direction we need to go, highlight key problems we must address, and convey the urgency of the situation. A just food system should, of course, meet nutritional need, provide good livelihoods, protect people's rights, and correct any inequalities, treat animals well, be resilient to climate change, stop and reverse environmental degradation. Principles 3 to 9 define a just process of change. Principle 10 highlights the need to use the food system transition to address systemic social and economic inequalities and vulnerabilities. That's a big demand, and of course, implementing these is anything but simple, anything but easy, because nobody is going to voluntarily step up and pay for their past sins, right? So principles are not a panacea in that sense. So especially for something as large and complex as food systems, they are meant as tools to guide conversations both at the global level and in specific contexts, and provide some relatively broad lanes of approach to a just food system. Basically, there will be different just transitions in different parts of the world. So if transitions is to be truly just, it will need to take a global perspective on justice, but tailor the strategies, actions, and priorities to the local context, especially because food systems are now globally connected. Even water poor regions are exporting grains to rich countries, for income, but they are getting hammered by climate change, extreme events, heat waves, droughts, floods, etc. So, ways forward, if we want to build support for large scale transformative change, we need a clear vision for the future. The principles laid out in this report aim to guide transition processes towards socially just and sustainable food systems. Food system stakeholders have a range of opportunities and the levers to promote just food system transitions, including policy processes, financing architecture, market incentives, global or local activism, and more. There is already significant awareness in many places around the world for some of the changes we need. Of course, greater transparency between producers and consumers, fairer treatment of farmers, secure land and natural resource tenure for local communities, checks on the enormous power of global agribusiness corporations, and so on. Many governments are also already trying to align incentives for food producers with sustainability priorities by removing or reducing subsidies on fossil fuels, synthetic fertilizers, etc., and instead providing incentives to adopt practices that work with natural ecosystem. So at the same time, some actions to ensure just transitions are needed outside the food system itself, including efforts to reduce poverty and ensure equitable growth policies, provide targeted safety nets for the poor, and facilitate voluntary migrations as a livelihood adaptation strategy, support economic planning and diversification, provide public health infrastructure, education policy, financial sector reforms, and to strengthen and enforce ecosystem and conservation principles. Honestly, this is a very broad set of ways forward. Each step is complicated and they all have feedbacks between them. Profit motives of the food corporations is one thing, but controlling water at local scales, sustaining the commons, protecting the farmers, especially female farmers, land tenure for females tend to be a problem in many places, and climate change is riding on top with chronic changes like warming or precipitation shifts and acute stressors like droughts and heat waves sometimes happening together, extreme events coming after droughts, and extreme rainfall coming after droughts, and so on and so forth. So this is a figure that basically shows the characteristics of a just food system. Nutrition and food security are critical for people as well as climate resilience, and greenhouse gas emissions affect climate, so we must keep in mind the mitigation and adaptation and how they affect food transitions and equity and justice in food transitions. Livelihoods again for people. So the food system should do all these things and also maintain ecological integrity for climate and nature in a holistic way. And of course, for people, you need the rights, protect them, and make sure safety nets are not being used to segregate some groups and so on. Power and inequality for people have to be dealt with in terms of improving food sovereignty for communities, giving them greater ownership over food production and land use, and so on. And of course, animal welfare. Who speaks for the animals? Ensure the welfare of animals in the food system as measured by nutrition, environment, health, behavior, and mental state of the animals. Okay, the way they are treated and cooked up, fattened, butchered, and sold makes you sometimes really be very worried about eating meat as much as you enjoy it, and so on. Okay, so what are some of the examples of potential tensions between just transition principles? There are many possible tensions that could arise in seeking to transition to a more just global food system. The hypothetical trade offs presented below may or may not arise in any given context. They are noted here to highlight the need for careful consideration in how the transition is planned. Transition may be good, intentions may be good, but the implementation has to still worry about certain things like increasing land and labor productivity versus employment. The push to increase productivity and lower farm costs to improve farmer livelihoods, reduce food costs, and or increase food security may drive the uptake of new technologies, which in turn may reduce the number of jobs on farms and result in net employment loss if the number of new jobs created is less than those lost on the farms. So, how to retrain and reskill the workers and get them into employment is always critical in these plannings. Food security and nutrition versus sustainability. Boosting agricultural production in many places could increase pressure on natural resources, such as fresh water for irrigation, monocultures replacing mixed landscapes, and creating other issues like erosion, landslides, and so on under heavy rains, for example. Greenhouse gas emissions reductions versus livelihoods and jobs. This is very critical. Mitigation should not affect negatively anybody, especially the sustainable development goals and the just food transition, just and equitable food system transition. The use of technology for more precise applications of fertilizers and pesticides, which would reduce greenhouse gas emissions, could reduce on farm labor. Reducing deforestation means the food system must increase productivity of existing farmed areas, which, as above, could see greater use of technology in place of labor. Reducing livestock numbers means job losses in some areas producing meat or dairy today, even if new jobs may be created elsewhere. Introducing zero deforestation rules for supply chains to reduce forest loss and greenhouse gas emissions could prevent some local farmers from being able to sell their produce. There are many more examples given here, but you get the sense of how you can induce unintended consequences with very good intentions on one hand, but harming some poor farmers or laborers on the other hand. So, who benefits from mitigation versus who gets harmed has to be tracked. Similarly, any food system transition uh, may benefit one group but may harm another group. So you have to always be holistic and have some kind of a full 360-degree view of the problem, the transition, and the solutions and their implementation. Okay, so I'm being supremely brief as usual, but I captured most of the most salient points according to my judgment. But if you want, you can follow up. It's a nice report available online. Please follow up, and nice set of references as well. Okay, see you in the next topic.